Hello, welcome to BackStory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. I have a guest who has returned from London to be with me again on the TV show. His name is Brad Borkin, and he has written a wonderfully interesting book that we talked about last time, When Your Life Depends on It. And he looked at the experiences of the Antarctic explorers and what is it that was learned about leadership and about resilience. And we're going to take it a step further today, aren't we, Brad, now that you're back again from London? And what do we want to talk about today that we didn't necessarily cover last time?
Well, it's great. Great to be back, and I really appreciate your welcoming me back to the show. And I want to focus more on Shackleton this time.
Okay.
And talk more about resiliency and what we can learn from the men when they were on the ice, and you can see in the photograph of the men pulling the boat. I mean, acts of desperation, of survival, but at the same time, great teamwork and leadership and adaptability to extreme condiends. And there's a lot to learn that's useful for modern living. And
oh yes, we need modern living needs leadership and needs resilience. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And you said that the people today are not really being given that kind of direction.
Well, I think people today need that. And one of the interesting things coming from England is that this is what they're starting to teach children in schools.
Wow.
They're actually starting to talk to children and say, one of the great skill sets that you need to develop is a skill set around resiliency. But it's easy to say to someone, be resilient or develop resiliency. And it's a whole other thing to say, how? How do you do that?
And what is it?
And what
right?
is it?
Yes,
So
I looked at a couple of definitions as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness, the ability of a substance or object to spring back with shapes, elasticity, ability to return to the original form after being changed. Ability to recover readily from illness, depression, adversity, buoyancy. And in fact, the American Psychiatric Association has that as one of their definitions. Resilience is a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats of significant sources of stress, family problems, serious health problems, and bouncing back.
And that's a great summary of everything that was experienced in Antarctica in the early 1900s. I mean, these people are down there, they're explorers. Their goal is to get to the South Pole or to do other types of exploration around the Antarctic continent. In the case of what is shown in the photograph, it was Shackleton's expedition called the Endurance Expedition, or what was also officially called the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, which is a fancy name for saying they're going to walk from one end of Antarctica to the other end of Antarctica and cross it via the South Pole. And so they're doing these incredibly hazardous things in situations where they have no communication whatsoever. And one of the things we say is written on the back of the book, the only communication is as far as you can shout. And in the Antarctic winds and the Antarctic climate, you can't shout very far, actually. And so they really are in a situation where they've got to be adaptable and able to deal with all sorts of different types of climate and situations. They'll be running out of food. They could be falling down crevasses. They could be hit by blizzards and all sorts of, and they're hit by all those different things. And in fact, one of the big thing around Shackleton, and also as on the screen, there's photos of the men, Shackleton and his right-hand man, Frank Wild. They're, as leaders, they're faced with all sorts of situations around having these 28 men, and they're sailing down to Antarctica, and their ship gets crushed in the ice, and they're stranded. And how do you then figure out that you need the resiliency and the adaptability and all of that to have the mental toughness to actually survive and figure out how you're going to get yourself out of there, because no one knows you're there. No rescue party's going to come for you, and you're on your own, and you've got 3 lifeboats, and and you've got the supplies left from the boat, from your big ship, and how do you get back home. Back home being for them mostly England or Ireland, and it's they're remarkable stories of, it's not just survival. It's survival in the most extreme conditions.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think when we were talking a little earlier over coffee, that the reason I'm so interested is that I had some survival experiences in the mountains. They were not Antarctica, but they're the mountains of New York State or Vermont, and I've been a cross-country skier and a backpacker and a hiker many years. And one time I went up to stay over at a lodge, and I was a member of the Appalachian Mountain Club, and we were going to go for a hike in the morning, and we packed a little sandwich for ourselves. I think I made a puny little peanut butter and jelly sandwich and didn't expect to be gone that long. And this man came out of nowhere and he said, "I'm the leader, follow me." And off he went. Well, he bushwhacked. He didn't follow the trails. He bushwhacked up the mountain that was very steep, and something happened to me that had never happened before or since. My leg muscles contracted and I couldn't walk, I couldn't move, and they left me behind. He left me behind and they followed. And sometimes that raises a question in my mind, how easily people follow someone who declares themselves a leader, when in fact they're not leading because they're not protecting everyone, they're not looking after everyone. That's not what I would think of as leadership. Only one man stayed behind with me for a while and then said, I'm going to, and spend most of his time talking about his heartache about his wife divorcing him, to which I was a trapped listener. And then finally, as my legs stretched out just a little bit, he said, I'm going ahead. I want to be with them. I said, don't leave me behind. And he said, and he was gone. And I called after him, I know why your wife left you. Anyway, now I'm stuck. They're telling me to wait there till they come back. Well, they never did come back that way, so that would have been a disaster. It was winter, it was cold. I knew I only had a certain number of hours to get out of there before hypothermia would set in, and so I had to make a plan. And the plan was not to follow the bad leader. And I found my own way. I found a little sign along the trail, probably done by the CCC camps when they used to put little wooden signs up. And it said the name of a village that I recognized, that I passed when I drive up that way. I said, okay, I'm going to walk to the village. And then when I get there, maybe there'll be a payphone, because there were no cell phones then. Be a payphone. I'll call up the lodge. I just accidentally took the flyer to the lodge in my pocket, and there was the phone number. I'll ask them to come and pick me up. And then I had a backup plan. What if that doesn't work? And what if that doesn't work? What will I do? What if there is no little village store in this town? Or maybe it's locked and closed. I'll go to one of the houses and ask for help. So I had a whole plan and a backup plan, and I kept going, and I kept going, and I kept walking. I only found out later from the real leader, because the hike had been hijacked by this man. He wasn't the legitimate leader. The real leader said I'd walked over 2 mountains to get there, and I knew I had only so much time. And so finally I did get down into the village, and as my plan, there was a general store. Inside there was a payphone. I had just enough change in my pocket to use the payphone and call them up, and I knew the couple who ran it because I was like on their board for this. And I said, come and get me, I'm over here. And he said, what are you doing there? I said, I'll tell you when you get here. And so I only had so many minutes on the phone. And then the man had an apple pie, and I was dying for a piece of apple pie. But I said, no, if I spend what the money, I might need to make another phone call. I can't have the apple pie. But I did have the terrible peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Well, I got back and took a nice warm bath and went to sleep for a while, came down for dinner, and only then did those other people return. They were on having a terrible time and falling down, and he left other people behind. And instead of being glad to see that I was okay, someone said, how did you get here? You know, how did you survive? And so from that, I think there are a lot of life lessons. One is that people, if you have a leader, it should be a person. What should a leader be? What should they do to protect people who are supposedly looking to them for that? And what happens if the leader isn't good? What do you do then? And I know you've got examples of that.
You know, that, in this case, I mean, Shackleton was a fairly amazing leader when in dire circumstances. And so once they had sailed down to Antarctica, and the ship ended up getting stuck in the ice and ultimately getting crushed in the ice, and they had these 3 lifeboats, he had various plans, like you're saying, a plan A, a plan B, and the first plan was they camped next to the boat, and they had so they took out all the equipment they could possibly salvage from the boat and set up tents near it. And then he's thought, okay, well, we can't just stay here. We can't just wait, because they're actually on an enormous ice floe. And the ice floe is drifting in the ocean. Now, this ice floe is miles across, but
it's still an ice
it's still flowing. It's not moving towards Antarctica. It's moving away from Antarctica. Well, eventually what's going to happen is, as the ice floe moves north, it's going to start melting. And when it starts melting, when it moves into warmer water, it starts melting and starts breaking apart. So it's definitely not a permanent home for them. And it's not, and so in doing that and being a leader, he's got 27 other men, and he's got to figure out, how do I keep the morale up? And do we move? Do we stay put? Do we wait for the thing to break up and then get into the boats? And he's wrestling with all these different choices. But in doing so, I mean, there's certain skill sets that he sort of developed. And so the men were in tents. And what he does is he doesn't let the men choose their own tent mates. He assigns people, and periodically he moves people around from tent to tent so that people don't form cliques. And if someone and if he's seeing that if someone's weak, I mean, like in your situation where they left you behind, he would not single out a weak person and say, this person is weak, we need to take care of them. He'd be, okay, everyone seems cold, let's go up, now we'll make some tea and serve everybody. And so it wasn't singling out, oh, this person's weak, this person, and kept them together as a team and kept the morale up. And there was the one interesting piece of storyline is there was a small mutiny, and that scene that we had of where they're pulling the boat is that one of the men who's trying to push the boat from behind stops and says, forget it, Shackleton, you're not the captain of the ship anymore, because ship's sunk. We're stranded out here. No one's going to come rescue us. Why should we listen to you? And Shackleton turned around and said, I may not be captain of the ship anymore because we don't have a ship, but I am leader of the expedition. And as leader of the expedition, I'm still the leader. And basically threatened the guy's life and said, I wouldn't hesitate to shoot you if I had to, for the morale of the men. And very quickly, I mean, within 10 or 15 minutes, they totally put down this mutinous behavior. And then he brought all the men together and explained that the only way we're going to get home is work together as a team. And there's just so many examples of his belief that they could do this and instilling that belief in others. It's just remarkable amounts of leadership and but also followership. I think people understood that you're not going to get there if you rebel. You're not going to get there if you become disorganized, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, the photograph that's shown there is as the boat was getting stuck in the ice. They're constantly trying to figure out how to get the boat out of the ice. Again, massive amounts of teamwork. They were never ultimately successful in getting the big ship out of the ice, but it bonded them together in a strong way.
I think that's really sort of what we're really thinking about, isn't it? How people bond.
And bonding is quite critical.
And he was very intelligent. He didn't want to set people against each other. He didn't want minorities. He didn't. People who would say, "Oh, well, they're not strong enough. They're holding us back." You see, people could turn on each other.
Yes.
And he made sure that didn't happen.
Well, there's a very interesting scene, and I mean, you can see there in the picture where the boat's leaning. The boat's leaning at about a 50-degree angle there. So at that point, you might think, well, if the ice breaks up, maybe the boat would right itself. But as the boat's leaning, it's also getting crushed underneath. And so the boards are splintering. They basically pretty much know it's not a recoverable situation. But one of the interesting things that Shackleton's team, Shackleton's the men, some were officers, and some were. It was called. You had the officers and the men, and that's the way they described. They're all men. They're all male human beings, but they were. You had the officer rank, and the officers were always treated better. They would have better food. They would have better accommodation, right? But when they're on the ice now, so they're camping on the ice next to this ship that's slowly getting crushed, and they have fur sleeping bags for the people who are going to be on this expedition. Don't forget, his expedition was going to be, we're going to walk across Antarctica. A small group of people are going to do this walk. So they had fur sleeping bags, thick, warm fur sleeping bags. But there are other people who are just sailors, and they're going to be on the boat, and they're going to sail down to Antarctica and then sail back after dropping Shackleton and some of the men off. They were going to sail back. So they had lightweight sleeping bags because they'd always be on the ship. So Shackleton gets the men together and says, okay, we've got 28 sleeping bags, there are 28 men, and only some of them are fur. So we're going to draw lots to see who gets them. And the very interesting occurrence happened where he had rigged the lottery for the sleeping bags. None of the officers got fur sleeping bags. All of the men, all the sleeping bags went to the lower ranking men. And it was this act of generosity and this act of saying we're going to break we're all in this together. And being all in this together means the officers don't have privileges anymore of that sort. And it was just, and the men were just absolutely flabbergasted that he would have that sense of that act of generosity. And there's so many times when he did those sorts of things that instilled a belief that
equality. Yes, and where we live in societies where the rich and the poor are considered totally divided, and some more worthy of attention from leaders and some less more worthy of attention from leaders. What you have is people turning against each other instead of trying to help each other, trying to care for each other. So this guy was quite a genius.
Yes, it's remarkable amounts of insight into human personality and survival skills.
Right.
But it's interesting it's interesting and useful lessons for modern living, because one of the things that he focused on was not just people having an adaptable mindset, but focusing on this higher purpose. And it wasn't about God. It was about the higher purpose being, we're going to get home. We have a mission. Our first mission was going to cross Antarctica. And Shackleton had this great goal of walking across Antarctica and being the first person to take this trans-Antarctic expedition. Then all of a sudden, when the ship was crushed, and that scene where the ship is totally destroyed on the ice, and this picture of Frank Wilde is looking at this totally obviously unrecoverable, it barely looks like a ship, and he turns to he gets all the men together and he says, now we're going home. He doesn't say we might go home. He's very insistent. Okay, man, the expedition, that part of the expedition is over. Now we've got another goal. We've got a higher purpose. Get all 28 men home. And in a remarkable feat of endurance, really. And the ship was called the Endurance, but
yes,
the irony of that is remarkable. That they.
So did they make it home?
Well, yeah. So the story is quite interesting because they were on the ice floe. And they always had these interesting names. They first had this camp, they called their camp Ocean Camp, and then they called their camp Patience Camp. It's like they just had to wait as this ice floe was moving. And eventually the ice floe was breaking up. And they said, okay, but now we got to get into the 3 boats. What do you take in the 3 boats? Well, you got 28 men, you got 3 boats. The longest of the 3 boats is 23 feet. So not a lot longer than the studio. And so what do you take in the boats other than the men? Well, you got to take food, you got to take they take a banjo, because it's like, anyway, well, why do they take a banjo? Because they need
music.
Yes, exactly. You can't just live in this environment and not have there are other emotions that need to be enabled, and having music, having someone they had an excellent banjo player, and he would, but what they did, they ended up with 3 boats. They sailed the boats to Elephant Island, 5 days, 5 nights in the boats through and they were cold, they were hungry, they were frostbitten. They arrive in Elephant Island. Elephant Island's in the middle of nowhere. It's in the Antarctic Sea, but it's not on the shipping lines. It's not on whaling. Nobody's going to come rescue them. And then he takes one of the lifeboats with 5 other men and sails that 800 miles across the roughest seas in the world to an island called South Georgia, which is inhabited. And from there they get rescued, and all 28 men live. And it is truly, it's the greatest small boat journey. The journey of what's called the James Caird. The name of the lifeboat was the James Caird. They sailed 800 miles. The greatest small boat, open boat journey in the world ever taken, and they hit so many challenges along the way. In the boat journey, they land on Elephant Island. I mean, on South Georgia, but they're on the wrong side. South Georgia is a mountainous island, only inhabited in one whaling village on the other side from where they land. Well, actually, there are several whaling villages. The one that they were aiming for, and they land the boat on the wrong side of the island, and then in the end they end up walking across the mountains. And it's much like your experience. It's like you're in the mountains. They don't have the right equipment. They don't have food. They've got a little bit of food, and it's a do or die effort.
Oh yes, I forgot to mention that there was the hunting season, and there were hunters out. I saw them along the trail with their rifles pointing, and I was only one walking, and I would call out, "Don't shoot! I'm not a deer." And I didn't ask them for help because I had been. Legend has it that they go to these hunting lodges and they drink a lot, and then they go out with their guns. And I thought, no, I don't think I can turn to them for help. That would not be a good idea. So that was yet another element, that was there. I asked you, I guess, as we were talking before, what's happened with your book in England. Are people reading it and watching it? And you told me you have an endorsement that you didn't have at the last time. And who is this endorsement from?
So the book's been endorsed by several interesting people. One of whom is Sir Ranulph Fiennes. And Ranulph Fiennes, in England, Ranulph Fiennes is a household name. He is the world's greatest living explorer. He's probably around 75 years old. He's done polar exploration in the Arctic, Antarctic, in desert areas. So has led a remarkable life, and he kindly endorsed our book, and he is the first person to circumnavigate the world. People have circumnavigated the world at the equator. He's the first person to circumnavigate the world across the poles. So going up up to the Arctic, walking across wherever there's land, walking, and wherever there's seas, sailing. But for the most part, going over land all the way up to the North Pole, walking across the Arctic, down through Africa, down to the Antarctic, walking across Antarctica, and then coming back up South America, so on. And it is a 3-year odyssey. And he is just the most remarkable man. And we're greatly privileged to have his endorsement.
And he says, thanks to this remarkable book, you won't need to face the extremes of Antarctic weather to learn of effective decision-making techniques that will help you in modern life. And I think that's really the key point here, isn't it? I mean, most people are not going to go out in the freezing cold, and I don't blame them if they don't. And in fact, I wouldn't suggest it. But we do need help, don't we? Techniques that will help you in modern life. Leadership. What is leadership? What is good leadership? Who should we follow? Are there people we shouldn't follow because they're tearing this society apart? What is survival? Didn't you also say something about, we were talking about, everybody talks about resilience and endurance, but they don't quite know what it is. And you said that in England now they're trying to teach children resilience.
Right.
And you don't yet, you want to find out what they're doing in the schools.
Yeah, very interested in seeing if we can weave these stories into that program. Because it really comes down to the higher purpose, right, into being adaptable, into having the right mindset, and also teamwork. And I think it's one of the real things that kids need to learn, that adults need to learn, is that we're all part of teams. And it's very clear in the Antarctic, these guys were, you had the men you were with, and that was your team. But in modern life, we have many teams we're part of, whether it's family units, work units, social groups, and so on, that can help us build that resiliency. And that's really part of it as well.
So it's not being a soloist who's competing with and stepping all over everybody to get ahead. It's just the opposite. And
it's exactly. Yeah. It's exactly the opposite. Yeah. It's seeing how being parts of teams and having purpose gives you an ability to ride out whatever's happening. And it doesn't matter whether it's political things that are happening, whether in England we've got Brexit and people are pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit, and that's all immaterial if you've got your purpose, you've got your team, you've got your what you're trying to achieve. All the other things, it's just background noise. Much like they had blizzards and they had food outages and they had various challenges, but they had their purpose. Their purpose was to get home, and it's in that remark. That way, it's similar.
So we need that too, and all of us need it, whether we ever step outside the door in the cold or not.
That's right.
Or whether we have furry boots or not. Yeah, I agree. And we're at a time where we want to look at leadership and say, what is this leader telling us? I was in a country a few years ago visiting a country where there had been a dictator for like 40 years. And there was nobody but him as far as he was concerned. And he had a palace that was something like 5 blocks long. And those 40 years, what happened to the people? Because he didn't care about them, it was all about him. And that's what you have when you have too centralized type of power. There needs to be more openness and more caring about other people as well.
Yeah, there are many remarkable instances with Shackleton where he had this very generous spirit and very focused spirit on how do we protect the men, how do we survive in this, and on one of his different expeditions, he's with Frank Wild, and there was a photograph earlier that we showed with Shackleton and Frank Wild, and they were on an expedition coming back. They had tried to get to the South Pole but didn't quite reach it, and they were on their way back, and they were all running out of food, and Shackleton they each had like one biscuit for breakfast, and Shackleton gave Frank Wild his biscuit, and Frank Wild tried to turn it down, and Shackleton said, "I'm going to turn it into dust and put it into, grind it up into the snow if you don't eat this thing." And Frank Wild said it was the greatest single act of generosity he'd ever seen. He'd never forget it. And he writes in his diary.
He's playing the parent, maybe that's the role of the leader is the parent.
And they did survive. Actually, they did survive. They
did survive.
They did survive it, but it was one of the remarkable, and you get surviving those experiences make for binding friendships, lifelong friendships.
That is true. You never forget them. Well, Brad Borkin, you're a delight. It's wonderful that you came back from England to come on my TV show and to talk about this really, really interesting book, When Your Life Depends on It. And it's really not so much about adventure as it is about survival. And what is it? Humans have survived for centuries and centuries, but what did they need to do in order to survive and to lead lives that were full of purpose and enrichment? And thank you so much for coming today, Brad.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm always delighted when you come and we have a chance to talk.
Great.
So thank you for coming to BackStory with Joan Goldstein.